Good morning. Summer of 1989, 7 families came together and they started to dream about a new church on the east side. And the dream was that they wanted to create a church where people could come as they are, regardless of where they're at in their spiritual journey. They could explore the claims of Jesus, they could hear the teachings of Jesus, and be invited to take steps forward in their faith journey. So a few months later, Timberlake Church held its very first service, November 1989, Elcott Elementary School in Redmond. And since then, it's pretty clear we have grown, right? We've added buildings and campuses. We've started ministries and various programs. We've helped launch several churches. In addition to that, we have done mission work here, near, and far. And I've had the opportunity to talk to several people who've been around for a while, and everybody says the same thing, and they say it in different ways. They say that this journey has been one big adventure, and it has included the highest of highs, but also the lowest of lows, and yet through it all, God has been faithful, which is why here we are, 34 years old, and we are thriving as a church. But here's what I know. The longer an organization exists, the easier it is to drift off mission. Right? Harvard University was founded in 1636, and when it started, the focus was on training pastors. As a matter of fact, more than half of its graduates during the first 50 years ended up going into full-time pastoral ministry. Now here's the deal, Harvard is a great institution, right? They're doing a lot of great things. Many of us here at Timberlake graduated from Harvard. And I probably shouldn't say us, I mean you, right? But that's just the reality. Harvard is great, a lot of you have gone there, and yet it's hard for us today to connect the dots between why Harvard was initially started and some of its focus to where it is today. As a matter of fact, just a few years ago, they hired an atheist to be one of their chaplains. That's how far it drifted. Now, it was a few decades into Harvard's existence where some pastors got together and they noticed this drift, and so they started talking about potentially starting another school, and they approached a wealthy philanthropist, Elihu Yale, and they shared their concerns, and he agreed, and so he got behind their efforts, and Yale University was started, and they focused on training pastors and raising up spiritual leaders. But of course, over the years, the focus has shifted. They just kind of drifted away from their origin. And I'm not booing Harvard or Yale. What I'm saying is, what happened there is actually very common with organizations that have been around for a long time, right? 1844, there's a 22-year-old man by the name of George Williams. George is working in London. He's earning money, he's becoming wealthy, and he notices that a lot of his peers who are making money don't have a lot of structure in their life, and so they're getting caught up in various addictions, they're getting caught up in different forms of behavior that are unhealthy, different aspects of crime, and so he wanted to redirect their lives and help them and shape them, and so he started a Bible study for young men. That Bible study grew into a movement that's known as the YMCA, Young Men Christian Association. Young Men's Christian Association. Here was the stated objective when they got started. They said, our object is the improvement of the spiritual condition of the young men engaged in houses of business by the formation of Bible classes, family and social prayer meetings, mutual improvement societies, or any other spiritual agency. Today, there are more than 12,000 YMCA locations. They're located in more than 100 countries. They serve more than 65 million people. It's a great organization. They're doing great work. But it's very different in its focus, right, than it was 179 years ago. And the reason why is because in the 1970s and 80s, when revenue was declining, the YMCA decided that they were going to elevate and emphasize its fitness programs. And then they were going to downplay and de-emphasize some of the biblical stuff. And it's become a family fitness center. In 2010, the YMCA even changed their branding to emphasize the Y over the YMCA, right? And so now we just call them the Y. And it's very, very easy for organizations to drift, including for churches. And so what I want to do for the next few weeks is I just want to pause, and I want to do 3 things over the next few weeks. I want to take time to reflect on God's faithfulness to Timberlake over the past 34 years. I want to refocus on our mission, and I want to remind ourselves of why we exist. Now, when it comes to mission, you may not realize this, but churches don't actually get to choose their mission. 2,000 years ago, Jesus was standing with his disciples for the last time. These are the final words they're gonna hear from him. And he decides to use this pivotal moment to commission them, to give them a mission, a purpose for which they were now to focus their lives. And here's what he said to them. He says, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. He says, teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you, and be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Now, when Jesus spoke these words, there was no church. And today it's estimated that there are more than 37 million churches that exist in this world. And every one of those churches have the exact same mission that's rooted in the words of Jesus to his disciples. And I would argue if a church's mission does not reflect the words of Jesus, they're not a legit church. They might as well close their doors, because every church, regardless of how they choose to articulate it, at its core level, have a similar mission, and that mission is to help people find and follow Jesus. That is it. Everything we do at Timberlake Church, everything, from the way we welcome people, to the food we give away, the coffee we give away, our children's programs, our student programs, the camps that we do, the events that we do, the services we hold, the worship nights that we, like everything we do, the mailers, the flyers that we send out, all of that is to help people find and follow Jesus. That's our mission. And it's rooted in this belief that Jesus is for everyone. Jesus is not for just an exclusive group of people. He's for everyone. So regardless of your age, your background, your demographic, your IQ, your financial situation, your marital status, Jesus is for everyone. But what's fascinating is if you were to talk to someone who's not a church person, you were to talk to someone who maybe has never attended and been a part of a local church, maybe just has heard just a little bit about Jesus, doesn't fully understand who Jesus, like if you were to talk to someone who is not a church person, you were to ask them, who is Jesus for? The answers are gonna be all over the map, but they're gonna all somehow reflect and indicate that, well, Jesus at some level is for church people, right? Because there's a lot of people who think, well, Jesus is for people who look like they've got their act together, right? And that's why when you say to someone, hey, would you ever be open to attending a church service with me? You wanna come with me to Christmas or Easter? There's, oh dear God, if I walked through the church building, lightning would strike, right? And they're being lighthearted, but they're saying my beliefs, the way I talk, the way I think will not align with church people. Those people are way better than I am, right? They seem to have their act together. And then there's other people who are just convinced Jesus is for people who like to be against stuff. He's against gambling and smoking and drinking and scary movies and cats. And if he's not against cats, he ought to be against cats, right? He's against anything having to do with sex, certainly. I mean, Jesus is against a lot of things. Then there's other people who they're convinced Jesus is for people who are out of touch with the real world. He's for people who are naive. He's for people who are weak-minded. He's for people who don't like science. He's for people who enjoy reading and praying and attending church services because that's what his followers do. And so the thinking, regardless of how it's expressed, tends to be, well, Jesus is for church people. And so naturally, most people assume that the church is for church people. Now, when I talk about church people, just so we're all on the same page, I'm talking about people like me. People who grew up as a part of the church, or they've been a part of a church for a long time, even if they didn't grow up in it. So they kind of feel comfortable in church settings. It doesn't matter which church they walk into, which denomination it's a part of, we feel comfortable, right? We kind of know how it all goes. We know when the music starts, we're supposed to stand. We usually know the words of most songs. We know that if we're singing about the Rock of Ages, we know that if we're singing about the Lamb of God, we're talking about Jesus. We know that when the pastor gets up there and speaks, that we kind of know the background of the stories he's saying. We've probably heard the stories before. We've heard the verses read before. Like we know where to drop off our kids. We feel comfortable dropping off our kids. Even if it's our first time in the building, we're like, hey, where's your kids, bro? Okay, great. I'll leave my kids with, like, we just feel comfortable because we're church people. The pastor goes, our Father who art in heaven, it's like, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is. Like we know it. Books of the Bible. Oh, you're talking from Genesis? That's the first book. Because then it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 2. Yeah, like we get it. Church person. So I'm not mocking church people. I am a church person. And most churches in this country exist for church people. And it's obvious because you walk in, it's like a big family reunion. Everybody knows each other, high-fiving each other. Everybody kind of gets along. You listen long enough, you realize, oh, everyone here is politically aligned with one another. They're all voting for the same candidate. You study the families, you're like, every family looks alike. It's a mom and a dad and 2.5 kids. You have conversations, and the conversations are fine, but they're just superficial. Nobody ever talks about any real problems, any real struggles. Pastor gets up there to give a message, and it's always about what you're not doing good enough, where you need to grow. You're falling short over and over and over. It's just obvious when you get around church people that at some level, it's us against them. Now, here's the deal. I promise you, I'm not mocking. I am a church person, but I need you to understand this. In the summer of 1989, when 7 families got together and started dreaming of a church on the east side, instead of starting a church for church people, they decided to mobilize church people and start a church for people who did not go to church. They decided to start a church for people who are indifferent to church or for whatever reason were de-churched, which is kind of problematic, right? It's like starting a Chinese restaurant for people who do not like Chinese food. That's what it's like, right? It's like, let's start a book club for people who don't like to read. But here's the deal. When Jesus launched the church 2,000 years ago, he did not start it for people with a similar interest or a shared belief system. He started it for people with a common problem. And the problem was they did not know where they stood with God. The problem was they didn't know what God felt about them. They always had this idea that he's irritated or he's mad at us, and which is why thousands of years ago, if something bad happened to someone, they just assumed the gods or the goddesses are out to get us. There's no way that they felt like they could truly connect with God. And so the church exists to help people connect with God. The only way anybody is ever going to find and follow Jesus is if they're able at some level to connect with God in a very real, in a very meaningful, in a very personal way. And so churches have a responsibility to help people connect with God and experience God and know God. But here's the reality. This isn't intentional. This isn't like purposeful. The reality is that churches often unintentionally create barriers for people to connect with God. And I've read books on this, and I've read the studies, and I understand I understand some of it, but there's a lot I don't understand. I do not understand this, the kind of the logic behind it, but here's what happens. When a church gets started, it's all about, let's reach people for Jesus. Right, let's be a blessing to our community. Let's serve, let's love people. And then as a church gets traction and they begin to grow and they begin to have more resources and they begin to have more influence and they begin to have facilities and all that stuff, what happens is just slowly but surely they start to lose some of their focus. Again, I don't fully understand it, but established churches tend to have this shift from being outward focused to being inward focused. They go from thinking about the community, caring about the community and loving the community to thinking about themselves. And this is an issue that every church in every generation has had to wrestle with. It's not just like those of us in 2024. Some of the earliest churches wrestle with this, and what I want to do with the rest of the time we have today is I want to look at a story in the book of Acts that shows us this predicament. Now, if you've never read the book of Acts, it is an interesting read. Okay, it was written by a doctor named Luke, and Luke in his book gives us a picture of what the early days of the church were like. Now, I'm gonna warn you, anytime we talk about church history, it can be very easy to get lost, right? Like, what are we talking about? Who's what? Where is this happening? So, I'm gonna do my best to walk through this, but for the next 5 to 7 minutes, you need to laser focus. You need to do as best you can, right? To just kind of zero in. So, you may not realize this, but in the early days of the church, everyone who began to follow Jesus was Jewish. Okay, they had grown up in Judaism, and so they all had a similar culture. They all spoke the same language. They all kind of had the same customs and traditions. From very early on, every one of them, as children, had been taught what's called the Law of Moses. That's the first 5 books of the Bible. Contains the history of the Jewish people, but a lot of customs, traditions, and rules that they had to follow in order to connect with God. And because nobody ever did that perfectly, they would have offerings and sacrifices they would bring in order to connect with God. Well, Jesus comes along, and Jesus, through his teachings, makes it clear, well, you're never gonna be able to follow all the law of Moses. You're not that good. You're gonna fall short of the customs and the rules and the traditions. Jesus began to make claims of being God in the flesh. And he says, you think it's all about what you need to do to connect with God. So I'm just gonna tell you this, that's all over. I'm going to become a sacrifice for everybody, once for all. I'm going to lay down my life. I'm going to die. And he ends up dying on a cross, right? Which provides forgiveness of sins once and for all. And he's saying, instead of bringing offerings and sacrifices, you can put your faith in me. Now, the reason this is so important to understand is because you can imagine this, as people start to follow Jesus, they've been rooted in Judaism their whole life. It's hard for them to just deprogram from things they had learned. It wasn't like they could just press a button and forget everything they had been taught. And so new Jewish believers had a tendency to mix and match the teachings of Jesus with the law of Moses. A little bit here, and we're just kind of put it together. And it didn't seem like that big of a deal, because for the first 20 years of the church, everybody who started following Jesus was Jewish. They all had this similar background, same way of thinking. Nobody really thought about it. But then things started to change. Gentiles, non-Jews, started to follow Jesus. What happened was the Apostle Paul and his associate Barnabas, they would go into communities that were not primarily Jewish. They would talk about the grace of God, and you had these Gentiles, these non-Jews saying, we believe. We want to follow Jesus. And you'd think, man, everybody be having a party. You'd think, man, all of the Jewish believers be like, this is awesome. Now the Gentiles are starting to follow Jesus. But that's not what happened. What happened is a group of these Jewish believers got together and said, man, these non-Jews don't have our customs and traditions, so we got to travel to their cities and their towns and tell them, hey, Paul, not everything he told you, he didn't tell you everything. Like, he told you about Jesus, but he didn't tell you that you also now need to embrace our customs and traditions. And I love how the Message Paraphrase Bible explains what happened. Here's what we read. After the Gentiles began to embrace God's grace, it wasn't long before some Jews showed up from Judea insisting that everyone be circumcised. It said, if you're not circumcised in the Mosaic fashion, you can't be saved. Now, I know that you would love for me to give you a 3-hour teaching on circumcision today. That's not gonna happen, all right? But the idea was male Jews believed that it symbolized in a powerful way that they belonged to God. It was a huge part of their culture. So when non-Jews started to follow Jesus, Jewish believers showed up and said, hey, that's great, but again, Paul didn't tell you the whole story. You got to follow our customs and traditions. All the men, listen up. You open your heart to Jesus, now go get circumcised. You go down to Great Clips, you get a little trim, and then you come back, and we're going to celebrate, right? But you can imagine, this stirred everybody up. There's debate, there's arguing, everybody feels like it's a bait and switch. And all of a sudden, these people who want to follow Jesus find that there's an obstacle in the way. And the obstacle was established by the church. Now, for some of you, you understand this because this is your story. This is why you were turned off to church for so long. You wanted to connect with God, but the church got in the way. You went through a divorce. And there were a couple of people in the church who just made it their job to make you feel unwelcome. You had an abortion. And there were just a couple people, but they were in the church. And they wanted to make sure you knew how wrong you were. You showed up to church and everybody loved you, but then they found out you were gay. And so all they could do was focus on your sexuality and not who you were as a person. You grew up in the church and you had lots of friends, but then you got pregnant and you weren't married, and all of a sudden there was a distance you began to feel. Or you showed up and you just wanted to learn about this Jesus, but everything was said in a way that you just couldn't understand. Or you showed up and it was obvious that people were friendly with each other, but nobody welcomed you. I'm telling you, it is so easy, it is so tempting for those of us who are part of a church community, without even thinking about it, to establish obstacles and make it difficult for people who want to turn to God. But the reality is Jesus is for everybody. And so when these mix and match Jewish believers started to insist that these Gentile believers follow customs and traditions and the guys had to get circumcised, there's a lot of tension. And eventually a meeting was called. And the question everybody wanted to answer at this meeting was, what are the requirements for following Jesus? In other words, who is the church for? Is it for people who are good at keeping the customs and laws and traditions? Or is it for people who drop the ball and fail and can't keep all the customs and laws and traditions? Is it for people who know what they should be doing but don't always do it? Now, I'm gonna warn you, we're about to get into a lot of names. So again, very easy to be lost. I hope you're able to follow me somewhat. The meeting gets underway, Paul and Barnabas stand up. The reason a lot of Gentiles are following Jesus is because of their message. And Paul and Barnabas say, hey, we started telling Gentiles about the goodness of God, and many of them started to believe. And here's what we read. They, Paul and Barnabas, reported everything God had done through them. So they said, we can't explain everything, but we know that Gentiles are following Jesus. Their lives are being changed. And then they sit down and some Jewish believers stand up and say, but they need to be circumcised. They spend time explaining why they feel like these new believers should be circumcised. Then they sit down. And then Peter, who was one of the disciples of Jesus, he stands up and he says, guys, I got to just level with you. I used to believe that Gentiles, if they were gonna follow Jesus, had to embrace the Jewish customs and traditions. I just don't believe that anymore. I've seen God is at work. And here's what Peter says to his friends. He says, so why are you now challenging God by burdening the Gentile believers with a yoke that neither we nor our ancestors were able to bear? In other words, we all know how difficult it is to keep the law of Moses. None of us do it perfectly. We're always dropping the ball. So why are we telling these new followers of Jesus they're supposed to keep the law of Moses? And Peter is fired up, and eventually he concludes with these words. He says, we believe that we are all saved the same way, by the undeserved grace of the Lord Jesus. Now, I cannot adequately express how revolutionary these words were. Because the Jewish people had always been taught that their works, that their behavior, that how they talked, how they lived, impacted how God viewed them. Some of you grew up in a setting like that, where you were taught by the church, taught by a pastor, taught by a priest, here's what you need to do. And if you don't do this, you're at odds with God. Peter comes along and says, yeah, that's the old system, but that's changed. That's the old way. It is a new day. And the new system is this. It's Jesus plus nothing. It used to be where we're the focus. It's all about us and what we can do for God. But now the focus is God and what he has done for us through the life, the teachings, the death, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It's all about his mercy, his grace, his compassion, his goodness, his kindness. Now, this meeting goes on for a while. And people are arguing and they're debating. And finally, towards the end of the meeting, James, who is the half-brother of Jesus, he stands up. He says, hey, here's what I can tell you. I've heard the debates, I've heard the arguing back and forth. It's just obvious that these Gentiles are putting their faith in Jesus. And they're not even circumcised yet, and God's at work among them. And so here's what James says. He says, and so my judgment is that we should not make it difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God. I could literally give a 3-hour message right now. Like, I'm fired up when I read this stuff. James says that our job as a church, the local church, that we ought to be characterized by an environment and a culture and an atmosphere and a spirit that says we're gonna do everything we can to remove the hurdles that keep people from connecting with God and experiencing his amazing grace. And James just spends the next few minutes challenging his friends to give up some of their preferences to help people who wanted to connect with God not experience hurdles in the process. And ultimately, the end of the meeting arrives and they write up a letter, these church leaders, and they send it to local churches, and the message is pretty straightforward. Let's not make it difficult for people who are turning to God. This is so important because all of us have preferences. We show up into settings like this and we have preferences and what people should wear. We have preferences and the music style that should be, the songs that should be sung. We have preferences in the volume of the music. We have preferences in the style of communication. We have preferences in how long the service should go. We have preferences in what should happen with our children's ministry and youth ministry. That's okay, we're human beings, we're gonna have preferences. But at some level, we're gonna have to learn to give up our preferences if we're gonna be a church that's effective at helping people find and follow Jesus. Our responsibility isn't to make everyone at Timberlake Church happy. Our responsibility is to make the message of God's grace accessible to everyone. And this is what Jesus did for us. Prior to Jesus, you want to connect with God? Offerings, sacrifices. It's about rituals and customs and laws and just keep trying harder and harder and harder. And then Jesus comes along and says, I'm going to lay down my life. I'm going to provide forgiveness of sins once and for all. I'm going to be the final sacrifice. God is going to be accessible to everyone. Now, I wish I could say after this church meeting, everybody lived happily ever after and they were high-fiving each other and everything went smoothly. But we all know, come on, there have been several defining moments throughout the history of the church where the church, through its words and actions, have made it difficult to follow Jesus. It's a lot, in my opinion, a lot like this ladder. This isn't the perfect analogy, but I know that when a lot of people show up into church environments, specifically in person, could be even online, but they show up to church environments, and they're not familiar with the church, they don't have background in church, they don't understand Jesus that much. The idea is, well, God is up at the top of the ladder somewhere. And I want to connect with him, but it feels almost impossible because most of the rungs have been taken out of the ladder. And they look around and they see people, and again, this isn't a perfect analogy in every way, but they look at people and they're like, man, these people seem to have found a way to connect with God because I watch the way they sing, and they sing with passion. And when the person's up there giving a message, they take notes or they agree, and it just seems like they understand everything that's being talked about. They feel comfortable dropping off their kids. They feel comfortable in the different environments. It seems like almost everybody here has been able to connect with God. I want to connect with God, but I'm not a church person. I don't know how to do that. I don't have that as my upbringing. And what ultimately happens, and this happens in churches all across the country, people get to the point where they conclude, well, I guess the church isn't for me. I'd love to connect with God, but I'm having a difficult time trying to connect with him through the local church, because the local church, everybody seems to know what to do, and they know what to sing, and they know where to go, and they just kind of know how it works. And so I'll just try to figure this God thing out on my own. I'm just starting out, and it's just too difficult. And the message that the church communicates over and over and over by our systems and our attitudes and the way we interact with each other is, we're sorry, but the church is for church people. Now, for the next few minutes, I'm gonna talk very directly to church people. So if you're here and you're like, I'm not a church person, right? I showed up with my girlfriend, she told me we were getting mimosas, and this is where we ended up, right? Hey, you could sit back with a smile, because I'm gonna talk directly to those who are part of Timberlake Church. And I'm gonna ask those of you who this is your church a very straightforward question. How do we avoid this at Timberlake? When people show up and they wanna connect with God, how do we make sure that we've created an atmosphere, an environment, and we've had this attitude that makes it possible? Because we are at our best when we make the message of God's grace accessible to everybody. We are at our best when we partner together to create an environment where people can grow in their faith and we don't overcomplicate it. At Timberlake, I want every one of you to be able to show up and connect with God in a very easy way. And as much as I want you to do that, I want your friends, I want your family who may not even believe in God, who maybe are really distant from God, who they maybe show up to a Christmas service or an Easter service, or maybe they're just going through a time in life, they're like, I'll show up with you today, whatever, and they show up. I want them to be able to connect with God. There is a lot at stake. So let me walk through briefly how we do that. One of the ways that we make the message of God's grace accessible to everyone is by creating welcoming environments. We've all been in environments where you walk in, it's obvious they are not ready for you or they don't want you there. We want every single person, starting with you, who walks through these doors to know we want you here and we are ready for you. And so at our various campuses of different sizes, we do this differently, but at the Redmond campus, I'll tell you, it starts, we got massive parking lot. So we got people out in the parking lot, smiling at you, waving right when you come in. So you feel like, oh, okay. You get out of your car, you can ask a question if you don't know where to go. We got big parking lots, so we ask all of our staff, we ask some of our key volunteers, park as far away as you possibly can, right? And yes, it's gonna feel like you are walking up a mountain, like you're doing a big old trail, and eventually though, you're gonna make it in the building. And let me tell you, we have signs out on our buildings. Why? We want people to know exactly where to go. We wanna just take off the nerves and the fear of walking into an environment like this. And then you show up and we got greeters at the door, and we try not to have so many greeters that you're like, oh my gosh, I feel smothered here, but enough greeters where you feel very welcoming. And then you go to drop off your kids, and we make sure that we have well-staffed programs for kids and for students. We don't want you to drop off your baby and for there to be one middle school student saying, hi, I'm the only one here today, right? The reason I don't stand up here and give you my strong political views is because I know if I just sit here and talk about politics, I'm gonna ostracize half of you. Jesus is for everyone. And part of being welcoming is just me being myself. I don't want you to ever feel like, Dave, if you're hanging out with me outside of this environment, I want you to say, yeah, Dave's same guy. Listen, I'm passionate wherever I am, All right, I'm passionate up here, I'm passionate, but I do not stand up here and preach to you like this. You know why? Because when I went to open a checking account at WaFed a few weeks ago, I did not walk in and say, I want to open a checking account. I just try to be myself. That's just how it goes, right? Create welcoming environments. Another thing we do to put rungs in the ladder is we do our best to be clear. We say we want to be clear over cute. So when it comes to even program names, right? When it comes to how we name our different programs for kids and for students, we name them by their grade or age group. So a first-time guest can say, oh, that's where I would bring my kid. We could call it Little Gremlins, right? We could call it the Diaper Demons, but nobody knows what we're talking about. And so we try to be clear. The message titles, we try to be clear. So this series is called At Our Best, and we're talking about when we're at our best as a church and how to create the kind of environment and be on mission that we want to do. The last series is called Sticks and Stones, right? The power of our words. It was clear what it was about. Now, we could do a series called Picture to Burn or Teardrops on My Guitar, and people are like, what's that? What are we doing, right? You ever been to an Italian restaurant and you open up the menu and it's written in Italian and you're like, oh dear God, pappardelle, pacini, I think, whatever this is, I want that. Right, we want to be understandable. Even the messages, you may not realize this, every Tuesday I get 10 to 15 people in a room, I give the message to them out loud. If Lance is speaking, Lance gives it out loud to them and then they evaluate. Get rid of that illustration. That doesn't make sense. Change this to here. Do this, do that. Why? Because we want the message of God's grace to be accessible and we want it to be clear. That's why I explain the context of verses. Before I started reading from Acts 15, I give the context. You'll notice that if I'm reading from 1 Corinthians, I don't say 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 5 says. I say no, the Apostle Paul, who wrote a letter to first century followers of Jesus living in Corinth, says this. We want to be clear. I could get up here and give some Greek and Hebrew and you'd leave here going, whoa, did you understand it? No, but that was deep. That was awesome. And I'm not against Greek or Hebrew, but I'm telling you why we communicate the way we do. Another thing we do to put rungs on the ladder is we choose to be generous. Why is that? Because the number one stereotype of a church, what is it? They just want my money. They're out for our money. So you walk into this building, guess what? See the coffee? It's free. Go get yourself a cup of coffee. Take it. Don't take the coffee pots, just take the coffee. Right, same thing with food, man. We got more food in this church than Chick-fil-A gives away. I mean, we just over and over. Why? Because we're trying to create a welcoming environment. Now, I don't want you opening your purses and bags and throwing food in there like it's a take-home dinner, but I'm telling you, we want to be a generous church. So most of our programs are free. And yes, on occasion we have to charge for things, but we just try to live open-handed. And obviously it's not free. It's the generosity of the people who make up this church. Why are we so generous? Because we're trying to put rungs on the ladder. Another thing we do is we have ongoing evaluation around here. Ongoing evaluation. What does that mean? That means we're constantly evaluating. A couple weeks ago, some of the directional leadership team and myself, we walked around this building, then we got in a car and we drove around this building and we just wrote down all the signage that needs to change. Constantly evaluating. We're evaluating cleanliness. We're evaluating the wording on how things are communicated. Well, Dave, feels like overkill. Feels like we're just becoming a business. Let me tell you, this matters when you start inviting your friends. A couple weeks ago, I had several of my friends from Wisconsin here. A couple of them don't attend church. I was so proud of our greeting, so proud of the way we welcomed people in the lobby and people who are just friendly and talking to them. The only part of our entire service that caused me tension was when we passed offering buckets. Now, I get it. It's part of church. You pass. It was the only part that caused me tension. And so we're no longer going to pass offering buckets at Timberlake. We're going to trust that you're going to be generous through online giving, through giving in our giving stations. We're just trying to make Jesus accessible to as many people as possible. We want to be a church where anybody can encounter God's grace, not just church people. Because we believe Jesus is for everybody. But it's not just something that the pastor can do or the staff can do. This is something we all got to do. You say, well, I want to be a part of a church like this, then you got to help. Well, I want to be a friendly church, then you got to be friendly. I want to be a generous church, then you got to be generous. Right? It doesn't require a Bible degree. It doesn't require a bunch of outgoing personality. It just requires a willingness to say, hey, I'm willing to be a part. We're at our best when we're all working together to put rungs on the ladder. So I'm going to close with this. I'm going to invite my wife to join me on stage along with my parents who are here today. So my dad grew up in a large family. His mom loved Jesus. His dad was a decent guy except for when he drank, and he drank a lot and he was abusive, destroyed the family. So my dad in his adolescent years had a lot of built up anger, spent some time in foster care, good family, but it's just tough, right? Well, then in his early 20s, he gets married. And as you can imagine, he brings the baggage of childhood into the marriage, specifically a lot of anger. But then my parents started having beautiful kids. And my dad started thinking, like, I want to change the course of our family tree. I want for my kids to have a different upbringing than I had, but wasn't totally comfortable with like how that was going to happen. And my mom was following Jesus, and she would talk to him about Jesus, and his friends would talk about Jesus. So he shows up to a local church, and he starts to hear messages taught and music sung, and just over time, it started to chisel away at his heart. And eventually the day came where he said, I don't understand it all, but man, I understand enough. I want to surrender my life to Jesus. And he becomes a follower of Jesus. Let me show you a picture of my dad from that time. The fact he's wearing a suit means he just returned from church or from a meeting with the mafia. But his decision, along with the decision of my mother that she had made many years earlier to follow Jesus, had ripple effects on my life and the life of my siblings, right? We grew up in a home where we saw the love of God lived out. My dad and my mother followed Jesus in a sincere way that impacted us kids. And I'm telling you, when you get my siblings together, 6 of us, I have 6 siblings, you get us together and we talk about our growing up years, none of us say it's perfect. We all give my parents a hard time because they were overly strict on things and they had a lot of rules and the law of Moses right here in the family. But we will say they love Jesus. They weren't hypocritical. We respect them. They're people of character. And all of us feel like we won the parent lottery. They pointed us to Jesus. And I'm so glad that there was a church in the mid-1970s that put rungs on the ladder that made it easy for my parents to connect with God. There was a ripple effect that happened. 15 years ago, started a church in Wisconsin. And people would come up to me over the last 15 years, Dave, thanks for starting a church. Thanks for starting this church. It's impacted my life. I said, I'm not being falsely humble. Don't thank me. Go find my parents. Thank them. Because they made a difficult decision. They had to navigate it. They had to figure out how to connect with God. I just grew up church person. This is easy for me. So you say, Dave, I'm impacted by one of your messages, or Dave, what you bring to this church, this focus, this energy, man, I appreciate it. Don't thank me. Thank my parents. Because I grew up in a home that lived this out. And I'm not gonna have them speak or say anything. I just want you to understand how this works. I'm asking you, I'm begging you, let's keep working together to be a church that puts rungs back on the ladder so that someone can come in, encounter the grace of God, and then begin to experience ripple effects in their family, hopefully for generations. I am thankful for the goodness and the faithfulness of God that was evidenced through my parents and through the church that I grew up in. And I'm just asking you to help us continue creating a church like that. So my wife is going to read a prayer that was written to be prayed over us. And this is how we'll begin to wrap up.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for your goodness, your faithfulness, and your blessings. As we begin this next chapter in the life of Timberlake Church, I ask you that you would empower us by your Spirit to help us find and follow Jesus. Give us wisdom on how to make the message of grace accessible to everyone, and help us to be effective in accomplishing the mission that you have given us. In the name of Jesus, we pray this. Amen.
Thanks for watching. But before you go, please be sure to bookmark this page so that you can find us again next week. And are you looking for a way to get engaged and join a team? The online chat engagement team is a role that anyone and everyone can do, and it's simple. Engage with people, create an environment where people are free to be themselves, and more importantly, open to receive the truth of Jesus. And if you're interested in joining this team and becoming part of what God is doing through Timberlake Online, please let me know on your connection card. Links can be found in chat, and I'll see you here next week at online.timberlakechurch.com.